Let's go.
Oh, we are live.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Wolfram Institute stream. Today, we are offering a special stream. We are going to offer you a guest lecture by one Rohan Mehta. So Rohan's actually a high school student, but he's a quite precocious, talented young scientist. I've been working with him for actually quite a few months on uh, rewriting systems and modeling chemical oscillators. Um, as multi-way systems. We're also joined by Bob, who also went to high school, though not as recently. And Bob, I mean Bob had a distinguished career in chemical engineering, and he gave some suggestions early on to Rohan that Rohan in turn followed. But I don't think Bob and Rohan have been in contact for many months. So this is
Yeah,
opportunity
yeah.
for Bob to see an update on what Rohan is doing. I'll say just a few introductory remarks about some of the motivations for Rohan's work. So one question that we were asking last year is as soon as as soon as one is modeling molecular dynamics or chemical reactions as rewrite systems, you can attain a rather granular view of behavior, and you can study actual paths, and you can study, say, multiple different possible paths by preparing multi-way systems of your given rewrite model. And one question is, well, that view that you gain with such a model, how does that differ from a more stoichiometric view, a slightly kind of coarser view? And so one thing that we thought we would consider is if you take some sort of chemical oscillator where the respective concentrations are, in some phase space are alternating, but they're alternating in some manner that is ultimately periodic. If you take some model that's known to be periodic, but you begin to uh, develop a rewrite model for it, which in Rohan's case began with a Petri net model. And then you take that Petri net model and you actually allow these things to be computed, and you see what is actually kind of computed in time. What kind of unique view can you gain? And so what we ultimately did, following one of Bob's recommendations, is that you could look for graphical motifs within these multi-way systems. So on the one hand, because it's an oscillator, there will be these large kind of loops that you will find, but there's only so many loops that are actually computed as actual paths. And so what you'll find in this multi-way system case is that you have all these computations, and in aggregate, you have these somewhat large multi-graphical structures that contain many loops. But the question is, how much information are you actually gaining when you look at particular computational behavior, when you study the actual paths that are being computed? Now, these paths, in turn, because of the oscillatory behavior, will kind of glue together to form these greater aggregate structures. But how much information, like topological information, can you gather by actually studying the particular paths that the computations were taking kind of consecutively? Now, that might sound somewhat obscure when I'm describing it verbally, but Rohan has many nice, not only computations to show, but many tests that he's performed looking at these computations. And so I think from here, Rohan can describe these these particular oscillatory systems that he's modeled, how he did so, the results, and different findings that he arrived at after considering many ways in which these multi-way systems could be studied quantitatively. So, Rohan, without any further introduction on my part, go ahead and tell us about the work that you've been doing.
Yeah, let me quickly share my screen. So I think you should be able to see the presentation. And yeah,
Yes.
like James said, I did this work on sort of looking at oscillating chemical systems from a computational perspective. And so I'm going to quickly go over like again some of the motivating remarks, but yeah, then I'll just dive in. So like James was talking about, a big part of what we were thinking about in the beginning of this project is how chemistry is, in a sense, has another dimension than we typically look at. And that's the dimension we typically look at is just the kinetics of our reaction. So we're basically looking at its concentrations and we represent those through its rate laws. So everything is expressed in the language of differential equations. And this gives us a somewhat limited perspective because chemistry is inherently a discrete and stochastic thing. So, for example, for the systems we're going to look at, there are individual reactions that have different behaviors assigned to them. And when we try and squash all of this down into a sort of continuous description of things, essentially just extracting solutions from differential equations, that sort of discrete nature of things gets lost. And yeah, that's a little abstract again, but hopefully that will become clearer on what we can actually gain from sort of switching from this perspective later on. And then the third sort of key idea here is also, like James mentioned, that to sort of build up to a theory of molecular computing in the long run, we need to view chemical reactions, chemical systems as programs. And a very nice way to do that is to look at them as Petri nets, which can be initialized with some series of starting concentrations for the species we're interested in, as well as rate constants for the reactions we're interested in. And then that behavior can be run across many different sort of input pairs of those two things. And then just to give some more motivation for why we chose oscillating systems, this was a very sort of new kind of science move where we want to look at systems which have relatively simple rules. So the reactions we're studying here have no more than 4 elementary reactions in the whole reaction complex, but oscillating behavior is obviously something more complicated than most reactions are capable of. So it seemed like a good place to start. And so I have executed everything in this notebook already, but I'll just run everything here in case I need to generate something on the fly. So just I have a quick overview for oscillating reactions. I don't know how helpful this will be, um, but I'll go ahead with it anyway. So the main oscillating reaction, the main thing that kicked off oscillating reactions, I guess this does have a slight volume to it, was the Belousov-Zhabotinsky reaction. And so I thought for a little bit of fun, I would include this video here. This is actually my AP chemistry class last year. We recreated this as my final project. So just to give you a better sense of what the oscillating here actually means, it means that the concentration of usually two species that we're interested in are changing. And so that's why in this example, the color of the solution is changing because concentration of those species is alternating. I'll stop it because there's a bit of volume in the background. Obviously, there's going to be other species involved, perhaps, and their concentrations might change too, but the species that oscillate are the ones we're usually interested in. And so what we did is we identified two sorts of initial oscillating systems, the beaverator and the brusellator. So the beaverator actually has a really interesting story. This is the simplest oscillating system discovered to date because it only involves two oscillating species. When I say it's an interesting story, it's because that this discovery and my stumbling upon it was actually through Twitter, which caused some issues when we were trying to figure out citations because it's not very easy to cite a tweet. But this was presented by Dr. John Baez, who I believe is a math professor at UC Riverside in California. And so he presented this system with a colleague, and it makes a big advance on sort of the existing chemical oscillators, which have around 5 or 6 species typically. And so just to give a quick overview of all these steps, this first step here is the autocatalytic step of the oscillator. And autocatalytic steps are something that are present across all sort of mathematical models of oscillators that we've developed so far. And one of the cool things that we were able to do in this work is actually show why this autocatalytic step is necessary. I think that's one of the things I was most excited about, and that's actually a relatively recent thing that we've stumbled upon. So essentially why this is called autocatalytic is because we end up with more than one species than we started with. So for example, we might have an assumed 2 moles of X here, and we end with 3 moles of X. So essentially X is catalyzing the reaction, hence the term autocatalytic. This reaction here is pretty simple. We're just converting X to Y. These two reactions are a bit more complicated, and they also represent a sort of unique feature of oscillating systems, or at least our models of oscillating systems. And that's the necessity of this open system. And I should mention that our models of oscillating systems tend to have these extra requirements like an autocatalytic reaction, an open system, because we try to swish a lot of behavior down into very few reactions. So for example, the Belousov-Zhabotinsky reaction, I don't believe all of its elementary reactions are actually known yet, but there are over 100 plus of them which have already been discovered. And that's obviously not a very like sort of tenable system to try and analyze. So we need to squash a lot of this behavior down. And that means adding some more expressivity, I guess you could say. That also runs into the problem that like the beaverator isn't chemically realistic, for example. But that's something that we can sort of, I guess, leave for the future because we'd like to at least understand how basic systems work before we try and implement them. So yeah, this essentially means that X is being sucked out of our system. So if we have some reactor, you could imagine some tube sucking X out at some time-dependent rate. And then again, this tube injecting X in at a time-dependent rate. And that's going to be mediated by whatever rate constant we assign to these two reactions. So,
And Beaver is the name of the town or the
right,
city
yeah, that's
in
another
which you're.
thing.
Okay. It has nothing to do with
Sorry.
busy beavers or yeah.
It's
Yeah,
for some
just
reason
same
it's
with
like
Brussels.
a
Yeah.
yeah, it's a I don't know what you'd call it, but a thing to name models of oscillating reactions after where they were discovered. So Brussels for the Brusselator. There's also an Oregonator, an Oregon Beaverator. It was some town that they were in when at conference or something. Um, so yeah, the Brusselator is actually what the Brusselator and Beaverator are very um, tightly interwoven, their relationship, because the Beaverator is directly a simplified form of the Brusselator. And in fact, it really just has to do with the calibration of rate constants that you can transform one to the other. The difference in these sort of extra species doesn't have any real impact on the kinetics except for making it more chemically realistic. So, for example, these two autocatalytic steps are the same. The essential purpose of these reactions, converting X to Y, taking X from our system, adding X into our system, are the same. And with the right concentrations of A and B and the right rate constants, you can actually get them to be identical. Um, we studied both of these. Again, you could see this as, I guess, different simulations of the same sort of idea of a reaction. And that's because what we were trying to do here was less so compare two very different oscillating systems, but rather sort of drill down on are there any key shared properties of oscillating systems. And I should mention that for oscillations to actually happen for the system, we do require an open system as well, but it's qualitatively different because essentially these two reactions here are independent and can be called whenever they want. The open system here can't really be very neatly represented as its own separate independent reaction. Instead, we have to keep the concentrations of B and A constant to induce oscillations. So that means like every time B is consumed in some reaction or A is consumed or produced in some reaction, we have to remove or add that as necessary to ensure that those concentrations remain constant at whatever values we find cause oscillations. And I think it's like molarities of 3 and 1.
Yeah. Rohan, if I might interject, the uh, Breleisov-Shabatsky reaction that you showed from your chemistry lab, it is strictly speaking a closed reaction because it's being run in a beaker, but it's consuming one of the chemical species present that's basically providing the energy for the whole system. And once that particular chemical gets totally consumed, there's no more energy left and the oscillations stop.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, I should have been more
Yeah.
clear about that.
If you were able to keep adding that, I believe it's cerium or a
Yeah,
particular
that's what
cerium ion.
cerium. I think we used a version which used magnesium, maybe if I'm remembering correctly. I think we found
Mhm.
a version for which we could use magnesium because I don't think we had cerium available.
Yeah, when you use cerium, it goes between black and yellow, I
Yeah,
believe. Yeah, and
ours
yours
was
was
red
pink
and clear.
and not quite so pink.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And so here, let me see if I can make that a bit bigger
Mhm.
so this will appear.
Yep.
Here are essentially sort of, we take these reactions and as part of the code we've written, you can really just put the specification of the reaction into a PetriNet function, and it gives you all of these functionalities to sort of simulate everything. And here I've just graphed out the PetriNets just so a better sense of like how all of this fits together. And so you can see the autocatalytic reactions have been highlighted in red. So we have 2x going into this
Mhm.
reaction, 3x coming out,
Mhm.
um, which is the autocatalytic except for these two reactions. And I guess to be a little more clear, so Petri nets are bipartite graphs where we have places which are basically where our species are, and transitions which are our elementary reactions. And so tokens can flow from a place into a transition at every time step. And I'll be a little more clear on how we determine those time steps in a minute. Um, and then that transition fires, that reaction fires, takes place, and it sort of rearranges what goes into it by spreading it out among the places. And obviously, it doesn't have to spread those in reactants which go into the reaction among all places. It can choose, however, based on what the elementary reaction is supposed to do. Um, let me
And
see
I
if I,
think to compare the two Petri nets, I'm not sure how it's represented in the Petri net formalism. One could imagine having an empty vertex for the beaverator that
Mhm.
is feeding into reaction 4 and coming out
Right.
of reaction 3, but um,
Yeah,
perhaps it would be superfluous. But um, you
there
you
is
could you could imagine that if it helps. Yeah,
that is the approach I think they take. John Baez does a lot of like category theory stuff. So I think they came up with some like categorical representation of like open Petri nets where they basically draw like a reservoir on one end, mapping stuff in, and then a reservoir on the other, mapping stuff out. But like in terms of the underlying sort of function, this is basically doing the same thing. It's just a little
exactly.
simplified.
Yeah, right.
Okay. I might have to adjust this so that things show at the
Oh,
proper size.
good.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So basically one of the first things I guess we wanted to do is ensure that ensure that well our models are doing what we'd expect. So like obviously if we don't see oscillations and we know something's wrong and we haven't modeled things correctly. So basically when we have that Petri net, we initialize it with conditions. We feed those inputs to the program, and those are the initial concentrations of our species. So note for the brucillator, I just sort of didn't show the other species. So that's I think A, B, Q, and L because it just becomes like a lot of extra information there. But those are constant throughout all of these. Only the things that change are shown. And so we set those inputs to the program. And then the way we actually evolve it in time is using this algorithm called the Gillespie algorithm. And so it's a pretty straightforward algorithm, actually. We have to calculate. So usually Petri nets are, I mean, you can think of each transition in the Petri net as being drawn from some distribution. Normally, this is just a distribution where everything is weighted equally. But in the case of a chemical reaction, that's obviously not interesting or realistic. So we need to cause this Petri net to be stochastic in some sense and weight this distribution based on how likely each transition or each elementary reaction is to occur. And so usually in chemistry, we are working with the assumption that all the species are in vast excess. And so we can calculate a rate law as the molar concentration of the reactants of that elementary reaction raised to their molar coefficients. And so that doesn't actually work necessarily at every scale. The correct way to do things is to calculate the probability of a successful collision, which we can think of as all the ways we can choose the correct reactant particles from the total particles present. So it's basically just the um, probability of choosing that formula that we have to employ here. And after we do that, we then just randomly draw from the resulting distribution and we pick a reaction. But the other important thing here is that we need to have some mechanism of how to like work with time, because obviously reactions aren't discrete as in they fire every single time, like second, like 1, 2, 3, 4. There can be a range of firings in between depending on the species we have present. And so the way the Gillespie algorithm handles this is it draws from an exponential distribution with the parameter lambda set to the total number of species present. And the effect of that is if we have a lot of species present, then the time we're going to draw is going to be very small. So we draw the time of how much to increment t. So we could start at 0. We choose a reaction to fire. We update our system. We update the species and at the places of the Petri net. And then we draw from this distribution and see how much should we increment our time t. And so, for example, that might be 0.05. We'll just assume seconds. The Gillespie algorithm doesn't really specify what units of time to use. So then we draw that, we say t plus that. So now we 0 plus 0.05, and then our new time is 0.05, and we just repeat that process. And by setting lambda to the total number of particles present, that means the time we draw is going to be a lot smaller when we have a lot of particles present and a lot larger when we have very few particles present, which is chemically realistic because the more particles we have, the more successful collisions we'll have on average, and the less time we have to wait for another collision to occur, while the opposite is true when we have very few particles. So basically, that's a very high level overview. But using that framework, we can sort of evolve our Petri net in time for a certain number of seconds. And then what we get is this long sequence of lists where each sublist will contain our Petri net, the reaction called, and the time step the time step of the reaction which that Petri net is representative of. And so I think the important thing to highlight here is especially we have reaction level information as in terms of what reaction was called, and that's something we'll come back to later as to how that is advantageous. But when we have all that information, we can basically extract the species from each place in the Petri net, and those are just the concentrations, and then plot them over time. And so when we do that, we see something like this over here. Note that I did calculate the deterministic rate laws for each of these reactions as well, just to give a sense of like what the technically predicted behavior is. Uh, and so these are stochastic simulations of the Petri net. And obviously, it will look a little different every time since we're drawing from a stochastic distribution. But you should note that it's not very obvious that these are essentially the same thing at first, because we start with very low initial concentrations, which means that the system is much more prone to randomness and fluctuations. And so if you look at like the amplitudes, for example, of what are predicted versus what actually occur, then those can be quite different initially. It does eventually converge upon something with a closer amplitude and period to the predicted system, but obviously it's still not extremely close, and that's because to sort of simulate these things realistically, we can't have like billions of molecules reacting, because then it would take forever to simulate even just a single second.
I'll
And
make one suggestion about this one, Rohan, which is if you take these final plots here, the plot range is highly influenced by the initial,
Mhm,
time steps, and I would recommend perhaps because like we know that we begin with these high values and then they collapse to something that's more periodic.
mhm,
I might suggest that you even consider starting the domain from time step 5 or 10 just to
okay,
eliminate this. I
yeah,
mean, otherwise you'd have to use like a log scale or something, but
right,
it's hard to appreciate. It's hard to see the behavior.
right,
Oh, that was a really
yeah,
sloppy thing. But I imagine that, with time, I think that the point is that as you're increasing these, this become it the stochastic simulation comes to further approximate this one, but it's hard to see that with the
right.
given
And I mean,
setup
I'll even
or the
note
given
that
display.
like
Yeah.
it drops the it's hard. I think I'll have some better diagrams which express just how quickly these chemicals drop. So for example, when we
Yeah.
solve the differential equations here, the boundary conditions can't even uphold properly, where we can actually graph it decreasing from 100, just because it drops like literally so quickly that it doesn't even plot beyond beyond 20 here. So I think it's a really dramatic effect.
Mhm.
And hopefully that'll become clear in a few other plots as well. So
Yeah, I think just restricting the plot range on the vertical direction will be sufficient to zoom in.
I
mhm,
guess you could do that as
Yeah,
well. Yeah. And
yeah,
then you don't have to you'll still see that drop, but it'll be a drop from oh 20. Yeah, maybe
yeah,
okay,
to match this one. Yeah.
okay,
yeah,
That's a good
yeah.
idea, Bob.
And well, the thing also is that you're starting with somewhat arbitrary initial conditions, 1, 1, 10, 10, 100, 100, which are very easy to rationalize, but they're not near the long-term periodic behavior. If you found, what the concentrations were for that orbit of the dynamical system and started closer to it, you would reach the oscillations much sooner, and you wouldn't have that initial big spike.
mhm.
That's just a characteristic of these dynamical systems that there's always a transient induction period before it settles into the orbit.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yep.
Um, I we also did again, just to sort of erase some of the fluctuations that can happen with such initial concentrations. Looking at what happens when we average multiple stochastic runs together. So here it's like 5 separate runs, I think, and that does tend to produce somewhat less dramatic behavior that is closer um to what is predicted. So for example, we don't have an amplitude as high as 40 in this case. And again, as noted, since the Brusselator and Reverate are pretty tightly connected, there isn't a large difference here. The Brusselator does tend to cycle more and have a slightly less an amplitude that is slightly less. But like I mentioned earlier, that mathematically just boils down to a calibration of rate constants. So I guess the point of this was really just to make sure that like we can have something to point to see that like oscillations are actually happening. And that's the point of everything I'm going to share on this slide. Actually, it was just a way of debugging and running a bunch of tests for the most part. So all of this data here can just be presented in a completely different form, but preserving basically what all the underlying data is. There's no new information really present here, and that's just graphing the phase space of the system. So with one axis representing the x-axis representing the concentration of x, y-axis representing the concentration of y, and so we just plot the various xy species vectors at all the points that we have data for. And so again, we can graph out what the deterministic evolution is supposed to look like, a single run of the stochastic evolution, and then what happens when we average these stochastic evolutions together. Again, this was just to ensure that essentially we are seeing the orbits we would expect. And this sort of mess here of the stochastic evolution is pretty jumbled. So we refined that later on in terms of how to better distinguish those orbits. But at least one thing I noticed that was slightly interesting through this approach is that uh, the plots of the kinetics tend to mask that there actually is a slight difference between the highest point reached by the concentration of y and the concentration of x. And again, that's due, for example, goes to like about 3.5 here versus slightly greater than 4. And that's again due to obviously there's an autocatalytic effect boosting x. So just a little bit of x causes this essentially runaway effect. And stable orbits have to get to this place in phase space where we have small and similar concentrations of y and x, which will turn out to be a more important point as we move away from these sort of basic investigations.
Rohan, just for clarification, the averaged evolutions that you're showing, you say n is equal to 5. You took 5 different trajectories from different random starting conditions or a
Right,
different random seed and then averaged them?
right. And because that there is a variable amount, there's variation in how many reactions were called because we're incrementing the time step from this
Mm-hmm.
random distribution. What we do is we just take whichever reaction of the ones we're averaging has the fewest data points, and then we trim everything to match with that. So there obviously is a bit of disconnect in terms of the data points that we're averaging might not necessarily line up in terms of time. So that is something to be aware of with those plots.
Yeah, I'm surprised that these phase plane trajectories line up so well. I would think that they could get out of phase so quickly and they would just average to a smear.
Yeah. I mean, so I guess this is a good moving on to this example. We did something similar here, but when we have a 3D phase space where time actually does play a more important role, what we did then is we actually created bins for the various times, and then we put all the data points around that point into a bin of that time. So I think it was like actually I don't remember exactly what the specific sort of bin value was, and then we averaged those bins together and then provide a single data point at that time. So it does, I think, overall still exhibit a rough image of oscillatory motions here. So one misconception I originally had looking at the system was that the stochastic evolutions seem to like have these decaying orbits which collapse upon each other. But I've only run it for 100 seconds here. If I were to run it for maybe 500 seconds, you would see that there's actually, it's just pretty random as to the size of the underlying orbit, which sort of speaks to how not unstable, but how variable the system is in terms of what sorts of orbits we will produce. I think it also strikes home a lot better that, and sort of we see this behavior, this sort of slingshot-like behavior recapitulated here, but the reaction has this way of navigating to a point in phase space where it can get to small x and y concentrations, and then from that point, it initiates a relatively sort of stable upward cycle of oscillations. And so having sort of gone through the motions here and seen that this is like behavior we would expect, it's consistent with other people see and produce in the literature. One interesting question is how can we like leverage the computational benefits we have by modeling the system from the bottom up and having this very discrete information about it to maybe paint a clearer picture of for example, one question that I was immediately drawn to is why is this happening? Sort of where is the interplay between these reactions, these specific elementary reactions that produce this overall macro scale behavior? And so let me see if I can put the next slide. Okay, so this was one of the things that one of the first things I thought was really cool that we were able to do. And this is taking the same phase space plots as before. And now what we do is we look at every two adjacent states of the system and we see what reaction was called between those states. And then I color that edge and phase space between them based on the reaction that was called. And so I think this immediately starts to provide a lot of clarity as to how the reactions are interacting with one another. Um, and so maybe it's useful to sort of go over what the anatomy of an orbit is. It's basically this triangular shape in phase space, and because we're simulating stochastically, it's a little rough at the edges. Obviously, it would be more of an oval-like triangle if we were to plot the solution to whatever differential equation encodes this. But we sort of have this downward, like slingshot-like motion, and this is taking our higher concentration of y, and it's converting it all of it into x, and that's
You
done
know,
by
one thing, Rohan, that I realize in hindsight, right now the Legends gives numbered reactions. I imagine so long as the font is small enough, you could probably just include the reactions
yeah. Mhm.
there so that people know red is
Autocatalytic,
people,
yeah.
yeah, uh people know which one is which. I think that'll help significantly.
Okay. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
a good idea. Yeah, these reactions match up. So this is match up is in the sense is red is the autocatalytic reaction, Y is the reaction which converts X to Y. Um, Green, I think, is the reaction that adds X. Um, and blue is the reaction that consumes X. Actually, let me quickly just check that. Yeah, so green is the reaction that adds, or sorry, green is the reaction that consumes X because it's taking an X, and blue adds X back to the
Yeah,
system.
that makes sense because you can see green is
Oh
well,
yeah,
I actually I don't know the direction in which it's moving.
so
Um,
it's moving along that axis.
no, but in which direction, right? So green is if green is reducing X, then it's moving towards the origin.
Right,
Those
yes.
green, yeah, okay. Yep.
Yeah, that's sorry. Yeah, it's moving toward the origin.
Oh, I
So,
guess the that's kind of obvious given the if you look at the bottom, we're
yes.
heading towards yeah, right,
Yeah.
yeah, obviously, right. Yep.
So,
And
oh,
time is going upwards, so if you can follow it in a spiral upwards as well.
Mhm.
mhm. So I think the first cool thing that I noticed from this, at least, is there doesn't, at least from what I've seen, tend to be a very clear explanation as to the importance of autocatalytic reactions for oscillating models of oscillating systems in the literature. But I think this diagram provides a very simple way to say that, which is basically that the autocatalytic reaction is sort of like this internal navigation device for the oscillating system that navigates it to the point in phase space where it can actually oscillate properly. Because I think I guess you could sort of think of it as um, this gauge of sorts, or this buffer of sorts, perhaps, which takes care of all of of species, of concentrations of species, which are too large to permit oscillations. Because basically what it's doing in all of these cases is it's taking higher concentrations of Y and converting them back down to X. And then when we actually get to a place of phase space where concentrations are small and similar, when we initiate an oscillation, obviously we're going to move away from the point that we're oscillating at. So we're going to need something to bring us back again to that point so we can continue to oscillate. And that sort of homing back in behavior, reining back in, I guess, of the oscillatory loop is what the autocatalytic reaction does. That's its a core purpose here, which I think is a nice way of sort of thinking about why there's this like one conserved element across all mathematical models of oscillating systems we have, to the best of my knowledge, have to have an autocatalytic step, and I don't think it's been very clearly explained, at least in plain language, as to why that is.
Yeah, this is nice. I mean, right. Given the open system model, the rule that is introducing X into the system and the rule that is removing X from the system, these are just shooting along the the axes, where the orange rule, the trade-off between X and Y is introducing some kind of ruggedness of the trajectories,
Mhm.
but it really is the autocatalysis that is effectively providing this trajectory from kind of these extrema along these axes to one another. So it's quite clean. Yeah.
Yeah, I also think it's
Do the red ones appear? I mean, okay, I can kind of see it in this example here. I think
yeah.
we can see some examples where red is but there is autocatalysis and it's not making one of these leaps. Like I think we can see some maybe there,
Mhm.
but um, nonetheless,
Right.
there are no crossings between the extrema along the axes without autocatalysis.
Right. And
That's what you need in order to close
mhm.
the orbit.
That's because like when we sort of wane down on our supply of Y, so the autocatalytic reaction, it fires so rapidly here because we have a good amount. It doesn't even need that much X. As long as it has a little a fair amount of X and there's a lot of Y, um its rate of collisions is going to be so enormously high that nothing else will really be able to compete with it in this region. And then when that Y starts to get really small, then it takes a significant hit in terms of how likely it is to fire. But essentially it has like this monopoly on the reaction over here. And then when we get here, it loses that monopoly, but no reaction really has a complete monopoly over here.
Mhm.
It's biased towards reaction 3 and reaction 2, which is reaction 2 exchanging X for Y, and then reaction 3 consuming X. There's a slight bias towards those reactions, but they don't have this like overwhelming majority that the autocatalytic reaction has, which leads to this sort of jagged edge behavior.
Yeah.
Uh,
Another thing you can think of when you look at these trajectories, at the lower right and the upper left,
mhm,
you're getting to tipping points in the system where you have a large excess of either X or Y. And when it gets large enough, the system tips and then starts going in the other direction. For
mhm.
example, consuming all that Y and producing X. Um, and yeah, I mean, we hear a lot about it in terms of climate change. Are we reaching a tipping point? Where levels of carbon dioxide and so on in the atmosphere get high enough that all of a sudden we're going to have a catastrophic change in our climate. Um, and those things do happen. And this is a real great example of showing that type of behavior on a very small system that you can model.
Yeah, that's a very interesting connection between both of those systems. Um, the only other thing I'd add, I guess, for this is that one thing I thought was interesting is the way I actually phrased this when I was sort of doing the write-up is that each reaction sort of provides a different move you can make in phase space. And so if you think of like the reaction as exercising this move set, there's almost this sense into which it employs different types of motion. And this is maybe imbuing the example with a little too much like of biology, but I think it's interesting the sort of motion it chooses to make along this axis, for example. And this is in part maybe due to how the overall reaction was come up with in the first place or designed, but it's this somewhat almost inefficient motion, I guess, of the a reaction 4 adds a little bit of X to the system, which then allows reaction 2 to exchange some of that X for Y and then fire at this
Mhm.
diagonal. And so it slowly is actually moving up, but like there's a sense in which maybe it would just be more efficient if could we find another reaction where actually it could just move in a straight line, and that would presumably take less time. But I just think it's interesting how this sort of illustrates the different sorts of like almost mobility that the reaction has in different parts of phase space and how it has to essentially sort of adapt to whatever the conditions are there to find a different way of moving to continue to close the loop. So I thought that was interesting.
Right. I mean, you could imagine introducing a rule where you change one of the coefficients radically, and then you might just have some, one. Well, yeah, no, it's a little more complicated than that. If you build up the requisite concentrations, at some point you could just have some darting motion, though you'd have to have, um, yeah. Um, we didn't really do much research in that sense, which is toggling some of the coefficients in the rules and seeing what their effect is. Um,
Yeah, I think it's the search space is just so enormous. It's a little hard to like
yes,
to it's a little hard to I don't know like see where to start. Um, I'm sure there are things we could have figured out to maybe do a little more exploration into that though.
Mhm.
yes. We managed to identify many cases of those, especially on the modeling and simulation front. Oh, we could have done this. We could have isolated that. We could have toggled this. The options continue. Anyway, please keep going, Rohan. This is going well.
So one of the other ideas I had was to basically plot the frequency of which these reactions were called. And sort of, I came up with this idea before I came up with this idea. And so this was confusing to me because I see these two reactions here being called so infrequently that it almost seems like they're not even important to the overall behavior. And so one of the things I originally talked about when I first was trying to write up these results is that trying to understand how these reactions actually play in a role in oscillations will be important. And so I think that we can make sense of essentially all aspects of these statistics from a mechanistic point of view using this model. And by that, I mean, why are they distributed the way they are? And also, why do their distributions change as we increase initial concentrations? So if you think of this is not exactly true, right? Because it isn't a perfect triangle. But if you think this as roughly triangular, then reaction one, the autocatalytic reaction, is essentially responsible for the hypotenuse of our reaction. So a hypotenuse of our orbit. So that's a very big chunk of the orbit, and it's entirely dominated by the autocatalytic reaction one. So it should have a sizable amount of firings within our reaction, whatever time step we're whatever time length we're simulating in. Then reaction two, we see that it is actually a pretty important part of the other two legs of the triangle, which are typically smaller, but because it is spread across two legs as opposed to one, it is also fired quite a
Sure.
bit and has quite a high sort of reaction frequency. And then reaction three and reaction four, they are each about half and usually less than half, because if you think about it, so when reaction three is called, it moves us invariably closer to our goal, but we can call reaction two a bunch and then just like go back down and like go a little more and go up and go back down. So there's not as much possibility for reaction three to be called as reaction two. It was sort of reminding me of as the way sort of cells try to increase their surface area. They have a bunch of these sort of little outcroppings, then going back in. And so that's what this behavior sort of reminds me of. We have a lot more potential to call reaction two than reaction three. So reaction three is not called as much, and it's only half of a leg of the orbit. And similarly, reaction four is only half a leg of the orbit. So this actually explains sort of why we see this distribution that we do, and it also makes a fair point, a fair argument for the fact, I think, that even very few sort of firings can have an outsized effect, because even though, like, for example, these 60 firings of reaction three look like they might not be overly important compared to the multiple hundreds that the other two reactions fire, we can see from these plots it's an essential part in sort of completing this one leg of the orbit.
Yep.
And then the other thing I thought was interesting. So we see, and you'll have to like excuse the axes, because like these aren't, even though they look the same height, the axes change. So just be mindful of that. As we increase our initial concentrations, the firing of reaction one increases a lot. The firing of reaction two increases a lot. The firing of reaction three increases very gradually. So we go from like 60 to 100 to 295. So it is definitely increasing, but very gradually. The firing of reaction four is essentially on average the same. And so this is also interesting, but again, we can mechanistically explain this completely from our behavior, right? Because when we start at 100, we start at a point in phase space where oscillations are just not possible. And so it falls to the burden of reaction one to help buffer that those initial conditions, which aren't very favorable, and again, navigate us to a part in phase space where we can do that. So it's like we're starting this one oscillation, but without having leg three. So we just have this, and by leg three of the orbit, I mean like this blue-orange alternation. So we just have this really long hypotenuse of the orbit that racks us up a lot of firings of reaction one. Similarly, we have a lot of X. So this was because we had a lot of Y. We started way out here. We have a lot of X. So now we have to take care of that. And we have a long second leg of the orbit. That gives us a lot of reaction two. And it gives us some reaction three, as we mentioned, but we talked about how reaction three can't be called as many times as reaction two during this leg of the orbit because of the way they move in phase space. So this explains why reaction one and reaction two have such high concentrations. It explains why reaction three, it grows slowly because we are giving it a lot more times to be called, but it doesn't grow as quickly because reaction two can just be called way more times here than reaction three can. So it has a much slower growth. But by the time we get to reaction four, if you think about it from its perspective, when the first reaction four is called, it's no different if we start at 100 than we start at 1 because we're starting at the same spot. It can't really tell a difference, and so it behaves as if we were calling it at 1 or 10 or 100, it behaves the same. It doesn't have any extra load. The extra load is this excess of X and Y that the other reactions sort of have to pick up the slack, but reaction four doesn't see any of that from its perspective. And so it just behaves as it normally would. And thus it remains constant across all of these iterations. And I thought that was a pretty slick way of sort of explaining the data.
Right. If you look at Gillespie's method itself, the probability of a given reaction being the next one is based on the propensity, which has to do with not only the rate constant, but also how much of the reactants are present.
Mhm.
And for the first three reactions, you've got a lot of X and Y present. I mean, they're present, but reaction 4 does not have any reactants. Okay, it just produces a little bit of X and
Right.
injects it into the system,
Mhm.
and so its
Right.
propensity, strictly
It doesn't
speaking, is
change.
0
Yeah.
and
Right.
shouldn't be drawn at all. So I'm kind of curious as to how this is actually working. Um, I'm going to try this out with my own software that can do these sorts of things. I've got the Gillespie algorithm set up, so I can try that. I've done uh, the Shabatinsky reaction, uh, and it works quite nicely, but it doesn't have any source terms the way yours does. I believe it has some sinks, but no, it doesn't have any sinks either. Um,
Hmm.
so this is interesting. But because that source term doesn't have any reactants, its rate has to be constant.
Yeah, its rate is basically just the rate constant that we assign to it.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how exactly small x goes. There might be a very little bit of x by the time it calls. It's a little difficult to tell without like printing out. But it's essentially close to nothing. That it's just the rate constant that mediates its frequency, its likelihood to be called. So I guess this was sort of one arm of the project, and what this arm inspired is sort of looking at these orbits. We also see these like jagged outcroppings here, which almost seem like they could be mini oscillations themselves. Like they come up and they go back. And so that inspired us to look at what sort of smaller level motifs might exist within this reactions network, and sort of like what role do they play in building up to these larger orbits, if any, or are they just sort of like unintended consequences, perhaps? And so the first thing we did to explore that was take this phase space and basically take every data point and convert that into a node, and then take every connection and convert that. Can't go to the next slide. Let's see. Okay, there we go. And convert that into a directed edge. And so what happens is that we end up generating these hypergraphs, which you can think of more broadly as slices of the multi-way system describing the entire reaction. And I'll explain that in a little more detail. So each of these,
I'm still not sure that I still don't think that hypergraph is. I mean, we've discussed this a few times. I don't think hypergraph is really the right term. I would just say that they're multi-way systems that you're studying at different time steps.
the only sort of thing I was thinking about that is, I guess the multi-way system is supposed to show all of how the system evolves if all available rules are applied, but we're only showing how it would evolve if one rule is applied, which is the rule we randomly draw from the distribution to apply. So I wasn't sure if that still technically qualifies as a multi-way system.
Well, the multi-way system would be all the possibilities at every single opportunity,
Mhm.
and a trajectory that your system follows is just one path
Right.
through that very much larger multi-way system. And you start out with a different random seed, and you end up taking a different path because, you chose reaction 2 instead of reaction 1 at some point.
Yeah, that was sort of my line of thinking as well.
Yeah.
Um, so basically, the way this works is I can hover over a node, and that shows me what like the state of that system is at that point. And it's a hypergraph because nodes can have multiple edges, because a node can be returned to a bunch of times, and indeed we would expect that to happen if things were oscillating. So these are the same graph, just in different embeddings. But if like, for example, if we take that like hypotenuse, which is a pretty regular repetition of the system, the nodes involved in that hypotenuse should be returned to quite a few times, because for the oscillation to happen, they have to be they have to be oscillated through. So we should see nodes with lots of edges going to them, and that is indeed what we see. And then again, sort of that navigating behavior of reaction 1, where we navigate to the proper point in phase space. Let's see, is it frozen? Oh no, I guess that's just all I have on this slide. Okay. That navigating behavior becomes these large, let me move this out of the way, large sort of like sort of linear sequential jumps here. So usually the reaction starts, this is how the embedding shows it. It shows the reaction starting here, working its way up, and then we have usually this explosion of oscillations down in this area. And these oscillations are sort of the large scale oscillations are sort of mapped by these horizontal bridges over here. But in this other embedding over here, the standard embedding, we see much more clearly how we have these big loops, but also how we tend to have, and this gives more credence to the idea of smaller scale oscillations. We have, let's see if I can expand that. We have all of these sort of like outcroppings over here, which show smaller scale loops that form in our system, sort of like bubbles on the outside of these larger scale oscillations. And I should be clear, it's not necessarily clear what the path is between these oscillations. We don't know if this loop is done like this, or if it's done like this and then wraps around back like this or whatever.
Right.
And so um, further things we did were trying to sort of mitigate how unsure we are about like how these loops actually build themselves out. But the main sort of benefit to visualizing them in this way is that there definitely are, we can see at this point, sort of smaller scale things happening on the sides, which it's a little bit more difficult to tell from the phase space. And once you work up to a graph-like structure, there are a lot of other operations which are much more familiar in the context of graphs, which are very helpful to sort of further explore this question.
I just want to say there is a difference between, so in the hypergraph case, you have an edge that
Mhm.
can accept an arbitrary number of vertices. So you have some hyperedge that takes like 3, 4 vertices. In this case, the edges are still only
Okay.
between two vertices, but you have several of them. So in this case, it's two vertices, several edges. In the hypergraph case, it's one
Okay.
vertex, several vertices. Or sorry,
Is there a word for that?
one edge, several vertices.
Is there a word for that type of graph, or is that just
I,
considered a normal graph?
I don't know. Nick, is there a term for graphs that admit multiple edges between
Just a
vertices?
multigraph.
It's a
Multigraph.
multigraph. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Right.
Okay.
Okay.
So these graphs here that you've generated, Rohan, each node is a different state
Right.
with a unique combination of
Mhm.
X and Y present.
Yes.
Okay. And they're just drawn out as a graph with an edge between each one as they were visited.
Mhm.
If we plotted them in the XY plane, we would still have the lines between them, but then they would look like the phase plane graphs you showed
Right.
earlier.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah. There's no new data being added. It's just a
Right.
different
So you
perspective.
basically just lifted them out of the phase plane
Right.
and think of them as rubber bands between the different points, and they just relaxed to these shapes.
Right.
Yeah,
And
nice.
the benefit of that is letting us see a little bit more of this fine-grained structure, which isn't immediately obvious in the phase space.
Yeah.
So
I wonder if there's any fractal character to these. You know,
I'm not
you
sure.
mentioned the small bubbles on the sides.
I think James, maybe was that something I feel like we maybe brushed on last time we met, or maybe I'm remembering incorrectly. I thought you had mentioned something similar.
I don't think I said that they had a fractal. Well, it would be interesting to see if the kind of the topological signatures kind of scale in a somewhat regular way, which might be somewhat analogous to self-similarity, though I'm not sure. But I think the key thing that Rohan is touching upon is that we have we have these graphs showing different uh, like the vertices are giving you concentration data, and we're showing the vertices that take us from one state to another.
Mhm.
But as Rohan mentions, it's not the case that traversing some particular path is following a consecutive computation that's actually being executed by the system. And so one thing that I think Rohan is about to show is um, an investigation into, are there loops that are actually computed by this system? So this was something that Bob had suggested, which is,
Yeah.
we're trying to, in pursuit of something like molecular computing, we're trying to find ontologies. We're trying to find objects or properties. Is
Orbits or are sort of noisily computed in approximation. Because, for example, I mean, I'm not going to zoom in here because I don't want it to get too slow,
yeah,
but
yeah,
there's lots of in between like back and forth edges here where we like reverse the direction of the system and create like a very simple oscillation between two states. So we might like go halfway through and then loop back, and then there might be a third loop that loops back around and finally completes this larger scale loop, which we see and we observe on the macro scale as maybe a change in color. But the actual perfect loop that is computed by the system isn't this whole thing. It doesn't compute this as a perfect thing from like one state to another without looping back on itself in between and actually creating
Hmm.
another loop. And so that was actually something that was um, not easy to. It's one of the things that doesn't seem like it would be an issue at first, but it turns out to be something that's pretty non-trivial. So let me go to the next slide. Okay, yikes. My computer's, I think I went too many ahead. Okay. So and this is, I guess, a lot of where we did that work. So the first thing I was wondering is there a better way to sort of visualize which nodes are oscillated through the most? So basically we can just pick every node and see how many edges go towards it. And if it has more edges going towards it, that means it's much more prone to oscillations. And so one thing I actually added pretty recently is we can see the edge that goes toward it, what color is it? What reaction is it? So the nodes, so that this is it's a pretty information dense visualization. And the histogram tells us, I'll just zoom in on one to make it a little more clear. It tells us, and I can hover over a specific column, and that is a specific state, and its height is how many times it was visited or oscillated through. And then it's actually a stacked histogram because for each of those states, we color the different portions of it based on what reaction it was that sort of oscillated through it that specific time. And so I think the one sort of just very basic thing we see at this, which is probably what we would expect by now, is the dominating effect in terms of the states that are oscillated through very frequently is that they're oscillated through by reaction one, the autocatalytic reaction, because it has that very sort of stable descent of the hypotenuse of the orbit. One other interesting thing I noticed, okay, well, two interesting things, I guess. So maybe if I make this a bit bigger, it'll be easier to see. I guess we can tell that there's not really individual spikes here, but rather these sort of like spires almost, which means that there's this almost preferred path that we take through these high frequency states. So for example, we don't have just one high frequency state and then like everything drops down. We have also another pretty high frequency state next to it, another pretty high frequency state on the other side, which means that there seems to be a preferred path in terms of we're oscillating highly through this clump of states together. So we're oscillating highly along this specific path of similar states. And this, again, is just lending more credence to the idea that there are these smaller scale structures forming. And the other thing that I wanted to say was just that the other sort of pattern that emerges here, and not really shown well in this histogram, but maybe over here, is that there tends to be a pretty dominant section of highly oscillated states that are formed through reactions 3 and reaction 4, even though they're not called very frequently. And so if we think about it, reaction 3 and reaction 4 undo each other. One adds X to the system, one takes X out of the system. And so they also have this ability to generate indefinite loops because they're really just undoing each other. And so we sort of see the behavior of them generating these structures here because they actually represent a sizable portion of various states, which is somewhat surprising because they're not called that often, but they do lend, I guess, maybe an outsized effect in terms of forming these smaller motifs. So if there aren't any questions on that, I can go down here. And so this is kind of annoying based on putting this in like a presentation format. These show up really big, but basically what we did here is we ran each reaction under these conditions for 20 seconds, and then we found all we found all complete paths in the network. So we can only do this for 20 seconds because after this point, it's just not tenable to compute anymore because of it just an explosion, combinatorial explosion of all the closed paths which exist, sorry. And so each of these closed paths can be regarded as a possible oscillatory motif. Yeah, so 20 seconds, and then I look at all those paths, I see how long they are, and I basically graph that in a pie chart just to get an overall sense of what are all of the possible motifs that exist in the network, because these are not necessarily the motifs that are taken. For example, if we have like this motif here, which again you can't really see. So this is plotting like one instance of that motif, a chain of 8 nodes maybe. That chain of 8 nodes might not be taken directly. It could be taken like 6 of the nodes, then we spiral and do something else, and then we come back and complete the loop. But here we're just looking at all completed loops regardless of the actual order in which they're taken. And so I think the thing that James and I sort of got from this diagram, initially at least, is that these reactions tend to be very good at finding lots of different possible pathways. Again, I ran this at a rather conservative estimate. I was able to run it a little longer and just requires waiting for about 30 or 40 minutes. But then you can get chains as long as like 100 or 200, 200 nodes long. And obviously those tend to be in the majority, making up usually far less than 1%, actually. And the majority is just these two chains of alternating reactions, which usually tend to be reactions 3 and reaction 4 undoing each other, like we saw here. Sometimes reaction 1 and reaction 2 also, because those also have the potential to undo each other. But this sort of shows us that there are a lot of different possible oscillatory motifs which could be taken. And then the question arises, how efficient is our reactions at actually exploring those motifs versus like what specific oscillations do they actually take? If that makes sense.
Mhm.
Makes sense to me, but I've been following this quite
Yeah.
closely. So,
Maybe if I show this, it's be more helpful. So what we do then is we look at consecutive motifs. So like now we have to add a time dimension in here. We say, what are the closed loops that are taken by the reaction consecutively? So I look at all the data I have, and I like basically enumerate all the states out in time. Whenever I return to a state twice, I say that's a closed loop. Then I take that, store that somewhere, and I restart again and just do that for the entirety of the reaction. And so as we would expect, none of these large scale orbits are counted out because we always run into a smaller sort of closed loop within the large orbit before we actually complete the whole orbit, because these are just, like I said, computed in a noisy way. But so these are run for 1,000 time steps. And this will give us a sense of which we'll explore even more below, that even though there are chains of extraordinary length here, we are not very good at finding them, or the reaction is not very good at finding them, and maybe it doesn't need to find them to generate oscillations. Well, I mean, obviously it doesn't need to find them, but, and this also gets more into the space of like, and this was something James and I talked about, like we tried to maybe come up with some sense of quantifying efficiency here, and ultimately had to table that because that seems to require more of a mathematical sort of like exposition, I guess. But there is a sense in which this gets into reaction design of like how would you even consider like optimizing finding longer loops or longer oscillatory motifs, which isn't an obvious question. But basically here we've just graphed those motifs out in phase space, and they're just assigned sort of the color keys here in terms of length. So these sort of small oscillatory motifs tend to sort of dot the exterior of the phase space, and the longer motifs are like insulated almost on the interior of these loops. So for example, you can see this little green here is a loop of length 4. See if I can find any other good examples. So if you can see that dark blue over there, it's maybe a
yeah.
bit hard to see against the edge of the system. That is a loop as well.
I suppose what we need in order to find the larger loops is to have some loop identification method that allows one to recognize small loops and, you know, save or store those, but then continue. And, you know, so you're finding these small ones, you find them, they're small length, but, God, but I think the
I actually
difficulty
did.
is
So I
the
did
thing.
do
Yeah, go ahead.
something. I did do something. I mean, I guess I can quickly bring it up. I did take it actually out of this presentation. I wasn't sure how useful it is. Maybe I can quickly have it in another notebook, I believe. Hopefully I didn't delete it permanently.
The challenge is these larger loops
Ah,
are kind of glued together transitively from all of these other smaller loops. And finding them is using the actual computations that the formal system is performing
mhm.
seems to be quite hard. It seems quite hard. I mean, you can plot them in terms of changes in concentration, to actually find them in terms of paths that are being executed by the oscillator. That proves to be more difficult.
Right. Um, I came up with somewhat of a workaround here. I guess we'll see if my code can run accurately in real time. So let's see if I have get what I call the function visualize orbits or something like that. Okay. So this should work. I guess I'll just run it down here and see. Yeah, because it's not taking. Okay, it probably doesn't need that argument there. Let's see if that works maybe. Looks like it's running.
How long does it usually take?
It shouldn't be long. Oh, my computer is starting to protest a little bit though. It's all a lot of data in here, I guess. Okay, yeah, so it's something to graph down there. So I guess I can move to that after. This is just we plot the motifs which are actually discovered. So it's the same sort of data as here. We plot them over time, and we run these for 5,000 time steps because, again, if you don't really run it for much longer than that, there's not much interesting data. Like you can see here, the majority is just like lengths, chains of 2 and 4. The rest appear like once. So we do have some. I mean, what this seems to suggest is that the discovery of motifs is linear in time. So, for example, after 5,000 time steps, 5,000 seconds, we found about 40-ish loops of length 4 and computed them perfectly. Some more interesting examples, for example, down here, and you'll notice that there's a lot more colors than there are things you see, and that's because usually they're just like dots. I'm not sure. I can't even find the dots here, but there's like just one instance, and so it's just a dot. You can't even draw a line. So for example, length 8 is this sort of red thing here, and it doesn't look very linear, and that's again probably because you would need to run it for even longer before you saw some behavior like that. But it looks, I guess, at a rough glance to be a sort of linear discovery rate, even though we can see like the rate at which possibilities are generated is far from linear, right? It increases much more rapidly, which is interesting and again perhaps has some implications for efficiency, although it's again not clear what those could be because maybe computing smaller loops is actually a more efficient way to generate that large scale behavior because you don't have to compute it perfectly and it allows more room for error. But at the same time, maybe you want a system that computes those perfectly. And so a noisy system isn't regarded as efficient for you. And I think that was part of the thing we were struggling with is because there's not really a good definition in terms of what is valuable in terms of molecular computing. It's hard to make an objective statement. And that's again, maybe because we need more of a practical interest in terms of someone to actually build something physical that defines what sort of behavior is valuable. But it just seems very wishy-washy to try and define efficiency unless you have a very sort of clear mathematical paradigm you might want to try and apply to this data.
I think, though, something that is emerging from this conversation is it's not, I'm not sure if it's efficiency, but there's some measure of the ability of the computations performed by this natural system, if we want to use that language, the ability of those computations to easily extract this topological behavior that we see in
Mhm.
the macro structure. So what we're seeing, especially in the plots above, is that yes, there are the if you look at the three D phase space plots that are highlighted, um, there are oscillations. They appear even graphically as these large loops, but our ability to actually compute, loops that are like when we say compute, we mean you actually step by step follow some reaction pathway and it forms a loop. We're able to extract very, very few of those interesting topological signatures consecutively. And so, yes, with more computational effort, um, probably can extract increasingly large ones. And I think that those demands the difficulty with which you can extract that behavior. That would be an example of, I'm not sure if it would be inefficiency, but I think that's a kind of an interesting measure. Like
Mhm.
with in whether or not loops are ultimately correct is another matter because this is something that
Right.
I think does particularly germane to oscillators. But I think in general, with alternative substrates for computing, the question is there has to be something recognizable that you're going to turn into some sort of ontology or object. You're going to try and recognize something important in the underlying behavior. The question is how easy is it without applying some higher level computation on top of that computation to actually extract the signatures that you're going to use in order to uh, yield meaning from these
Right.
natural
Yeah.
processes, right?
And I to that same point, like you were mentioning, this is something more recently I've also done, and this is also a little bit of a misleading picture, but uh, let me see if I can just quickly make this a little smaller. Okay.
There you go.
Yeah. So I just went out of presentation mode quickly because I haven't had time to like format this correctly. But so basically what we're doing here is I want to try and get a sense of, can I capture the larger scale orbit dynamics? And so I generate approximate sort of sequences for the length of a large scale orbit by looking at what is the most frequently visited node in the graph, and then taking that node and counting how long it takes to return to that node again, counting that as one large loop. And so that works to some degree, I think. So first of all, a lot of these are very small. So these are definitely not large scale loops. But what I've actually done is I've already filtered out all of the results that return to me back of length 2. So
Hmm.
if I was actually to plot out like the data, like the length of all the loops I get. So like, sure, I get one of 104, maybe 74, 39, 392. In between all of these loops, what I found empirically is that they're just like a bunch of small loops of length 2, like 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, which essentially it gives us the sense, and this is what we saw again from these graphs over here, that these highly visited states tend to be like little sinks. So whenever you get close to a sink, it sort of has this gravity that pulls you in, and then the reaction gets stuck there like a almost like a ping pong ball for a while, like back and forth, like getting stuck in this little sink, and it oscillates a bunch back and forth, and we get a bunch of loops of like 2 or maybe even 4 sometimes, and then it finally gets the energy, or I just eventually through chance sort of escapes, and then it goes along and does a long like nice sort of broad loop, and it comes back again and gets stuck, and then this process sort of repeats. And there's obviously variability. Like you could definitely count this sort of 16 or this 124 as getting stuck. I think it's less of a sync behavior at that point, and like maybe sort of escaping, but then like hitting a dead end and then being forced back, and then you have to try again. But there's this sense in which they're sort of like anchored to these high frequency states, and they have to sort of escape them, escape their influence far enough that they can go on and complete a loop. And so
Hey,
again,
sorry, Rohan, what is the vertical? So as we're going from yellow to blue, so to speak, or vice versa,
so
what what's being parameterized by the
So this is
colors?
just this is just as they occur through time. So it's a left aligned bar graph starting. This is the first loop we detect, and then going downwards, if that makes sense. So like this is the first loop that is detected, and then this is the second, and this is the
And
third.
and it's of length 104 is the first one that we detect.
Right. And again, that's maybe misleading if you think so. If we're graphing 500 seconds, and this is something that I think I've had to continually remind myself of too when looking at these plots. 500 seconds for like something as dense as like 100 things. That's a bunch of. I mean, I haven't counted it, but that's like at least a few thousand of actual data points that we generate through the Gillespie algorithm, because this thing is usually called at like increments of a second, never not full seconds.
Yes. So how is that particular orbit chosen? If um,
So to get around the fact that like it won't actually be a perfect orbit, it'll be noisy, I take the most frequent state in the whole system and then like count all the states that happen until I return to it again. And that usually gives a larger scale enough structure, which those could be those could likely be equated to orbits. I mean, in some cases, for example, and there's I guess additional sort of visualizations that one could do. I just wasn't sure really how fruitful of a direction this was, whether it was worth the time for that. Like perhaps 392 is actually sort of two orbits, which we capture as one because we don't cycle through the state perfectly on the second orbit. But like, so for example, if it's on the hypotenuse, we may come down, but like miss it as we go through, and then we have to spiral up again until we hit it. So there's a lot of variability in this, and um, yeah, there's just a lot of
Yeah.
variability in it. It's just sort of
I'm
giving
not sure what
some.
to interpret from this particular one.
Yeah, that's like I mentioned, I ended up choosing to sort of exclude it. But since you brought up if there was any way of detecting those larger orbits, this is just sort of what I had come
I
up with.
see. Right.
But I don't think it's really that useful, which is why I chose to ultimately take it out. But
Ouch.
um, so that I guess brings us to the conclusion of sort of the project. And this is, I think, basically all that, at least, I mean, the way we did this is there were a lot of sort of side things that sort of attracted our attention, and a bunch of rabbit holes we went down, which I haven't really put in here because they didn't they either led to questions which it doesn't really seem like we have the tools to answer quite yet, or just seemed like something that didn't actually wasn't actually that admissible to any new interpretation. But this is essentially what we were thinking of as sort of like putting out there as somewhat of a final product. And so I think the main sort of takeaways are that by looking at these systems beyond their sort of macro scale concentrations and kinetics, and by simulating them from the bottom up in a discrete way, stochastic way, which is much closer to how they behave than extracting idealized behavior from the rate law, we get a lot more fine-grained detail as to how they are behaving. And that allows us to say a lot of things which seem like they would be important if we wanted to use this to potentially compute something. It's not straightforward how they would be important, but this greater level of detail does give us a lot more ability to try and imagine how a molecular algorithm, for example, could be engineered or designed to behave in a reliable way to do something, rather than just looking at the kinetic behavior of it. And uh, in particular, I think the sort of interesting things that seem important, which have come out of this from my perspective, is I believe this is the first instance of actually providing empirical evidence as to what the autocatalytic step is doing for an oscillating system, and that's usually because all of that specific reaction level behavior is just squashed out when we look at the solutions to some differential equation, and that lets us mechanistically explain the reaction level statistics for each of the systems, like how frequently the reactions are being called. Again, we can sort of get this more rough idea of there being oscillatory motifs within the system, which is something we're able to hypothesize, visualize, and then ultimately identify. And then also, it's sort of interesting that these specific reactions seem to have a linear rate of discovery, even though motifs have an exponential rate of creation. And so, yeah, I think this is obviously I think it opens as many questions as it answers, to be honest. But in particular, I was pretty happy with this result because I like to be able to understand things in a sort of atomistic sort of way, and I think this provides a very clear intuition for how each of the parts of this oscillatory reaction are sort of working together to build up to this more complex behavior. And so I think it would be interesting to, in a very NKS-like fashion, continue to mine this universe of different interesting systems under this framework. These tools have been refined to a point where I think the code, I mean, has been refined to a point where I think it is pretty okay to put out into the world. There's been working with it for a while. It doesn't seem like there's too many bugs left, and it should be relatively easy for people to just plug in an algebraic representation of reaction and be able to generate all of those plots and some more, which I haven't shown here. Some other chemical behaviors I think might be interesting to explore are coupling. So this is also Dr. John Baez has this interesting paper on terms of like interpreting coupling between chemical reactions through conservation laws. So for example, this would require bringing in some sort of notion of thermodynamics to these systems, which we really haven't talked about yet. Like we've just been assuming we can set the rate constants to whatever we want and everything will be okay. And obviously that's not very physically realistic. I also saw some interesting work on sort of using Petri nets for isomerism and by extension homochirality. And personally, I think that's quite interesting. So I would be excited to see if there are any possibilities to simulate something like that under this framework. But that's most of what I have to share. So thank you.
All right.
Very nice, Rohan. One thing that your results here are kind of begging to be plotted. Each of your states you're representing by a value for the X and the Y.
Right.
how about taking the ratio of those and seeing what the
Mhm.
frequency distribution is for the ratios? Make a histogram of those.
Okay. Let's write that
That
down.
could be interesting.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I think you're probably having some of these loops at different scales as well. That you have some large loops, and then you probably also got smaller ones that roughly have the same kind of shape in terms of I think the ratios of the amounts of X and Y present
Okay.
along them.
Yeah, that's an interesting
Um,
thought.
that could be, take these loops and color code the vertices by the ratios of the states.
Okay.
And see, and that might let you, if you correlate that with where they occur in your phase space,
Hmm.
let you know if they're, which side of the triangles they're on, or the hypotenuse, which legs are
Right.
the hypotenuse they might be on, and you might see some regularity there as well.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. And I think that
Yeah.
shouldn't be too hard to do given what the framework for the code looks like. So
Hmm.
I'll definitely check that out.
Rohan, I trust you're writing these suggestions down, right?
Yeah, I'm writing them in a separate
Okay,
notebook.
okay, cool.
Yeah. Yeah. And just out of curiosity, had you seen that my compartmental modeling Packlet has is live on the Packlet repository? It has all the tools to do this sort of work,
Ah,
at least to do the simulations and set up the reaction systems.
No, I hadn't seen that. I'm not
Okay.
sure. Did it become like recently, or has it been out for a while?
The Packlet repository was publicly announced in the fall.
here,
So,
I'm gonna put a link in the Twitch chat. It's there, and I'll put it on YouTube as well.
Because I think James,
yeah,
maybe we had talked about this at some point as potentially putting this code out as a Packlet too. But
Yes.
if something like that already exists, I'm not sure if
yeah, yeah.
that would be
Well,
worth it.
well, you've developed plenty of functionality, at least as individual. Something that you've made should go into either Packlet or function repository
Yeah,
Okay.
or at least the notebook repository. So, yeah,
at, at the very least, right?
yeah. The Bulasov-Shabotinsky reaction is one of the examples that I have for oscillating reactions in the systems biology section. And it's also got the
Well,
reproscillator.
this is cool. Hey,
Yeah, we had talked about maybe doing the repost later at one point.
wow, you have many functions here, Bob. Wowee, look
Yeah.
at all this. Wow.
Yeah, I've been playing with these things for the past 20 years. This is like the third incarnation of it.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Look at all this.
Do you want to share your screen?
Yeah, I can stop sharing and then James, you can.
Oh, well, any of us can. Well, here, I have to delete
Well,
all
you're the
these
one
other
that's doing
tabs.
the oohing and eyeing. Why don't
I
you?
know, I know, I know. Hey, just 1 second. I have a mess of tabs now. I have an isolated one.
Let me remove.
You're the one who's oohing and awing. Okay. Hold on. Um, you see it?
Oh
You
yeah.
see me
Yeah.
moving up and down? Okay.
Yeah. I like the SIR
So,
model
yeah.
there.
Compartmental models are a convenient way to describe and analyze processes that involve the movement of items from one place or state to another. Items can be money, people, molecules, ideas. The compartmental model itself is just a representation of the information or data that can be converted into other mathematical representations, such as differential equations, for analysis. Compartmental models are used frequently in the fields of chemical reactions, systems biology, ecology, epidemiology, pharmacokinetics, and many others. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I
Yeah.
wish. When did you publish this, Bob?
It first went into the Packlet repository about a
Oh,
year ago
wow.
before it was live.
I see.
The repository was publicly announced in the fall, sometime around the tech conference.
Yeah.
So, but if you go to the guide, well, yeah, you're on the guide page there. If you scroll down, well, yeah, in the systems biology modeling section, the kinetic reaction network model. If you go there and need examples, yeah, there's the UV
There's our friend.
reaction.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And you can see
Ah,
the oscillations there.
aha.
And as one of the reagents gets consumed, you just lose momentum and you run out. Regulatory networks,
This is
and then
cool.
the repressilator there, which is another oscillatory system.
But a genetic one, right?
Yeah.
This is cool.
And there is a Gillespie solver in the system. So any of these systems can be simulated stochastically, or take the differential equations that they can generate and solve them with ND-solve.
Ah, okay.
So yeah, we're using this a lot with epidemiology models with one of our clients.
I see.
Yep, and I was using it a lot during the earlier stages of the pandemic, modeling various models for COVID.
I wish we knew about this sooner.
Yeah.
No, no, no. It was better that Rohan did what he did.
I wish I had known about it sooner. I could have kept it a secret for for all this time.
Yeah. No, I think Rohan has a lot of good ideas of his own. It's good to go through the exercise of building the stuff out. So, yeah, we can compare
Well,
notes. That's for sure.
Yeah, I definitely did learn a
yes,
lot from this project.
Yeah,
I did too.
yeah.
Well, Nikolai, do you want to have the final word, as you like to
No,
do?
I actually knew about this, the compartmental model, Packlet. I've seen Bob presentation on the COVID-related epidemiology, modeling with this Packlet. I thought it was cool. Yeah, it's a very cool Packlet.
What about Rohan's
And Rohan's
presentation?
project, yeah, it's a good exercise, as Bob said, to do it yourself. I also agree. It's a very good education and bunch of ideas floating around. Yeah,
Yeah.
much better than just work to work with some giant system that you don't know really uh, how works. How
Yeah.
it works. Better just try to work it out yourself first. It's always good. I also
And he
tried to
did
do
he
it.
did work it out himself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one I will say just in closing, what I found especially fun about this project is I'm sure we've all Nick, Bob, we've served as mentors at various different education programs, and sometimes you have students where they need help every step of the way. Sometimes they need you to really do the coding for them. In Rohan's case, it was fun because Rohan would have an idea, we would discuss it, we would determine what's the next question to solve. I would give Rohan questions, give him some suggestions regarding what the results would look like or how they should be presented, and then Rohan would go do it. He would develop the functionality, he would run the experiments, he would visualize them himself, and so that for me that was quite impressive, and that's why I thought we should even have Rohan give a guest lecture because that's the kind of the I mean it sets a good standard for everyone. Rohan as a industrious, precocious high schooler, I think he's setting a good example for even for people at the institute, where we have a question, just find the right way to articulate the question with some understanding of what we want the result to look like, and then you run the experiment, develop the code, find a nice crisp visualization. Sometimes, I mean, Rohan and he's not including many of the tests that were run, many of the presentations of the results that were given, and what we found is just by continuing to probe and to ask, is there information that we're not seeing in this particular representation, and just continuing to make queries about the properties. We just continue to push the study further and further. Like one key insight, right, which was one of those smack yourself on the head moments, is when we decided to create 3D phase space plots with a time axis, because again, we had some presumption that these phase space plots were kind of
Okay.
attracting towards some relatively stable orbit, and then you run them with the time axis, and you see that they start to attract closer towards the origin, and then they come out, and there was no obvious behavior there. And then, well, can we color code this by reaction? And it was a very good exercise, I think, for Rohan in learning to ask questions, just continuing to ask questions about these formal systems and see how you can continue to extract more behavioral information about them, and then show them to other people in ways that they can appreciate. Nick and I often have kind of playful, back and forth about me liking pretty pictures. Nick is always saying, oh, James likes pretty pictures. James is very strong on visualization, but I personally believe in visualization as an important aspect of the computational method. When you're running computational experiments, you're trying to understand how formal systems behave. It really helps to take complicated behavior, even a complicated data structure, and find some way to accentuate certain aspects of the behavior, isolate, compare, contrast, include in higher dimensionality. I think it really helps. So, I don't know how we would have made sense of much of this behavior if we had not, bar charts, even things like pie charts.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah.
I found it to be
It also
helpful.
just
So
makes it easier to analogize, basically. Like, at least the way I've been thinking through all of this is like thinking of this as like a sort of living, breathing thing. And I mean, I think that came across, maybe I was describing, like, I thought of the way I sort of illustrated the phase space, at least when I was like writing this up, is like thinking about it as sort of a creature changing its movement. And I mean, like, maybe that's just the way I think, but I think like seeing this like colorful image helped me sort of articulate that a little bit better.
it's the way Stephen thinks too, of computations as being like these creatures, or these forms. He uses that language quite often. Well, I think this ended up being like maybe 90 minutes or so, but that's fine. Well done, Rohan, in spanning that period of time. I will say that was a strong presentation. I mean, I'm biased because you didn't have to actually teach me much, but actually many of the descriptions that you provided were kind of novel and nuanced, and I hadn't heard you describe some of the research in the way that you did. So yes, well done. We can continue this discussion. I mean, now that you're in contact with Bob again, I'm sure that there's much to discuss, especially regarding uses or connections to what Bob has done with this compartmental modeling packlet. So, Bob, thanks for meeting. I know it's a little late, and well, Nick, I know it's wicked late. I mean, Nick's in Russia, for crying out loud. So thank you, everyone, and Rohan, once again, well done. And
Yeah, thank you.
we'll have a follow up, and you'll have a follow up with Bob, and we'll all follow up. Besides Nick, I think Nick's going to go to bed. I mean, we'll follow up, not immediately anyway. So thank you to our viewers. I'm not sure if there was anything that we missed on the conversation side. I don't think. No.
Any questions on the chat that came in?
No, I looked and I didn't see anything, unfortunately.
Okay.
Might be not the best time of day or of the week. But anyway, yeah, well done. This was fun. I was glad to see Rohan share this in front of a larger audience. All right, see you all later. Cheers. Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Yep.
Friday night, etc. All right.